Eleanor Roosevelt changed the role of First Lady dramatically. Eleanor served as First Lady of the United States from 1933 to 1945 during her husband, President Franklin D. Roosevelt's 4 terms in office. Born in 1884, Eleanor, former President Theodore Roosevelt's niece, was a shy child with an unhappy childhood. Both of her parents and one of her brothers died when she was young. Eleanor married her distant cousin, Franklin D. Roosevelt, in 1905. After Franklin suffered a polio attack, Eleanor urged him to stay involved with politics, and she stepped forward to campaign and give speeches for Franklin. President Harry Truman called Eleanor the First Lady of the World. While Franklin served in office, she became heavily involved in politics. Eleanor spoke out on human rights, traveled widely, wrote a newspaper column called My Day, helped the country's poor, and aimed to broaden the scope of the New Deal. Following Franklin's death, she remained in politics for the rest of her life. Though controversially viewed due to her outspokenness, she is widely recognized as a life-altering humanitarian that worked towards social and political change. Eleanor is especially remembered for her civil rights activism.
Eleanor worked with immigrant communities in 1903 at the Rivington Street Settlement House. This marked the start of her social activism work. However, she did not begin fighting for African American civil rights until she became First Lady in 1933. During her first years in the White House, she traveled 40,000 miles, reviewing the hardships the Depression brought. Although she visited many poverty-stricken areas that were home to African Americans, she did not begin to recognize institutional racism until she started supporting the Arthurdale Homestead Project. In 1933, Arthurdale was the first homestead project to take place during the New Deal. It was created to house displaced and jobless coal mining families and was largely supported by Eleanor. Unfortunately, African Americans were not allowed to participate in Arthurdale, so Eleanor pressured the Subsistence Homestead Administration to admit them, but they refused. The refusal ignited her support of the Black Civil Rights Campaign. In hopes of discussing her failure with Arthurdale, Eleanor invited Walter White, the executive secretary of the National Association for Advancement of Colored People, and other Black leaders to the White House. The meeting resulted in further opening of Eleanor's eyes to the full extent of racial discrimination that took place in America. Furthermore, she believed lack of education was the root to all the problems and stated that wherever the standard of education is low, the standard of living is low.
Throughout her time as First Lady, Eleanor encouraged and assisted the advancement of the Black Rights Campaign, regardless of extreme lack of support, including opposition from her husband, President Franklin Roosevelt. For example, Eleanor urged for the moral basis of democracy, which entailed that the rights of minorities should be guaranteed. She compared Hitler's Aryan racism to the racism in America. In 1934, Eleanor lobbied for the Costigan-Wagner Bill, aimed to make lynching a federal crime. However, Franklin refused to support the bill in fear of losing Southern votes. In 1935, Mary McLeod Beaton, a prominent Black educator, was appointed Special Advisor of Minority Affairs by FDR, partially as a result of her close friend Eleanor's encouragement. In 1939, the Daughters of the American Revolution prohibited African American singer Marian Anderson from performing at the Constitution Hall. Outraged, Eleanor withdrew from the organization and coordinated a new performance at the Lincoln Memorial. In 1942, Eleanor helped Pauline Murray by defending sharecropper Odell Waller, who was convicted of killing a white farmer. Regardless, Waller was executed. In her early days as First Lady, Eleanor confronted racism in the military. She countered the Navy's restriction on African Americans and advocated for the training of Tuskegee Airmen. The success of African American units during World War II proved that they are just as capable as the white men, leading to President Truman's decision of ending segregation in the military in 1948. This great step towards integration was largely credited due to Eleanor's leadership in the Democratic Party.
Eleanor also supported other civil rights movements, such as speaking out against anti-Japanese prejudice after the attack of Pearl Harbor in 1941, and privately disputed FDR's act to force Japanese Americans into internment camps. Eleanor was known for being the eyes and the ears of the New Deal. She worked for social reforms by increasing civil rights, labor legislation, and work relief, including better wages and working conditions for women. Eleanor's involvement in civil rights activism sparked controversy, as Eleanor's support of Black rights made her unpopular in the South. Untrue rumors of Eleanor Clubs and Eleanor Tuesdays began to spread, accusing African Americans of violence and disobedience towards whites. After she died, Martin Luther King Jr. summarized her commitment to racial justice. The impact of her personality and its unwavering devotion to high principles and purpose cannot be contained in a single day or era.